the next guest that we have doesn't really need an introduction. How many of you know who Alex Newman is? Absolutely. So it's my distinct pleasure to be able to introduce him. He has been a really good friend to what we did. In fact, Alex is the kind of guy, I called him up when we first started the idea of doing this, and I said, Alex, could you come and MC? Could you come speak at this? He said, sure, Bill. Like, oh, okay, that was easy. Because he's that kind of guy. He's a patriot. He's somebody that is really committed to the causes that we're looking to make sure that we have our constitutional freedoms. And so without further ado, it's my honor and pleasure to introduce Alex Newman. You want this?
Hey guys, good to see you. Thank you for being here.
Take my card here. You got it?
I can hold it. Very good. All right. Oh, I love you guys. Thank you. It's a great honor and a pleasure to be able to speak with you guys today. And I have a really important topic I want to talk about. And we have a crisis in our country, as I think we all realize. We have government at all levels misbehaving. And until we understand the principles that our country is founded on, we're never going to fix these problems. I can just tell you simply, electing the right president, whatever, all that stuff is great and we should be involved in that. But it's not going to fix the problem until a critical mass of Americans understand what it was that set America apart, what the principles were that our country was founded on. So we're going to start from today and we're going to work our way backwards. We're going to do a little bit of a history lesson today. And I really want to talk about lesser magistrates standing in the gap and resisting tyranny. Now, we probably can't control Congress here. Even if we can control our member of Congress, there's hundreds of others that are controlled by special interests, lobbyists, people who want to kill babies, people who want to take away your freedom, people who want more of your money. So we have to do something different. Right? What was that old joke that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and over again? That's us. We're trapped in a never-ending hamster wheel. If we just get the right president, we're going to fix everything. We're not. We've got to understand these principles. So when our founding fathers created our founding documents, they did separation of powers. And even little kids in government schools know that. Oh, 3 branches of government, where the president and the Supreme Court do everything, and Congress is a rubber stamp. But that was horizontal separation. They also separated powers vertically between state and federal. In fact, it was the states that came together and created the federal government as their agent. And they gave that agent a few limited tasks that it was supposed to be in charge of. Now imagine you hire an agent to represent you. Maybe you want him to paint your house yellow, and you come back and he's painted it pink. You say, wait a minute, I hired you to paint this yellow. What do you think you're doing? They say, oh, by the way, you're going to have to pay me $8 million for that. We all recognize that would be ridiculous. And then that's exactly what the federal government is doing today. They are way outside the bounds of what they were created to do. And so every official in the government, elected and appointed, down to your local dog catcher, they take an oath to uphold and defend the United States Constitution. And if you're a state official or a local official, also probably your state constitution. And yet, very few have even read these documents. How can you take an oath to uphold something that you haven't read? Okay. So let's start with the 10th Amendment to the Constitution. I think most of you here are familiar with it. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. It's pretty simple, and actually a lot of the Founding Fathers didn't think that was necessary. It's so obvious that if we didn't give them that power, they cannot be exercising it. Why would we need a 10th Amendment to make that explicit? It's clear. Here's the list of powers. They're not allowed to do anything that's not on the list. And yet some of them thought, well, who knows, maybe future generations will get really stupid. We'll just put that in there just in case. And today we act like that doesn't even exist. Now, a lot of federal supremacists will point to Article 6, Clause 2, the so-called Supremacy Clause. And I'm going to read it to you, because it's an important clause. It says, this Constitution and the laws of the United States which shall be made in pursuance thereof shall be the supreme law of the land. What does that in pursuance thereof mean? Does that mean anything that these clowns cook up is going to be the supreme law of the land? If they tell us we all have to participate in killing babies, we all have to hand over 100% of our money so that they can do who knows what? No. Self-evidently, no, right? We're talking about laws that are made in pursuance thereof. Now, what if the laws are blatant contradictions with what the Constitution allows? Well, then, of course, there are no laws at all. That is what our Supreme Court has said many times. That is what all of our founding fathers understood. And that is also what many of our state officials have understood down through the centuries. And again, all elected officials and government officials take an oath to uphold the Constitution that has those words in it. So what does that mean in practice? Well, I have some encouraging news. We're finally starting to see some pushback. Just in the last few days, I did an article about this 2 days ago for my website, 26 Republican governors announced that they were going to refuse to comply with any World Health Organization mandates, decrees, or policies. Why there were only 26, I don't know. Why any governor would want to take instructions from an actual former ethno-Marxist terrorist from Ethiopia, the puppet for Bill Gates and the Communist Chinese, I have no idea. That should have been 50 governors saying, hey, we're not going to be obeying whatever silly stuff you come up with. But 26 is better than 0. 26 is better than 12. So we're making progress. The Republican Governors Association also came out and agreed. Here's what they said. The World Health Organization is attempting one world control over health policy with their new pandemic agreement. Put simply, Republican governors will not comply. Okay. We need a whole lot more of that. They sent an excellent letter to Joe Biden articulating that in very clear terms. I encourage you all to read it. Now, Louisiana, earlier this year, passed a law saying that in the state of Louisiana, the World Health Organization's decrees and directives and recommendations are null and void. They have no effect or power. The WHO, the UN, and the World Economic Forum have no jurisdiction or power within the state of Louisiana. Why don't we have something like that in Florida? Right? We have a super majority of Republicans in the legislature, supposedly. You all know there's lots of rhinos. We've got a rhino infestation. But this is a no-brainer, right? They said no rule, regulation, fee, tax, policy, or mandate of any kind from the World Health Organization, United Nations, I call it the United Abominations, and the World Economic Forum shall be enforced or implemented by the state of Louisiana or any agency, department, board, commission, political subdivision, governmental entity of the state, parish, municipality, or any other political entity. It's brilliant. All 50 states should put stuff like that on the books as long as Washington, D.C. wants to behave like an unchecked emperor. Now, Alabama, a decade ago, passed a bill doing something similar. They banned Agenda 21. They banned all UN agreements and other processes in their state. They called it the Due Process for Property Rights Act. And here's what they said. The state of Alabama and all political subdivisions may not adopt or implement policy recommendations that deliberately or inadvertently infringe or restrict private property rights without due process, as may be required by policy recommendations originating in or traceable to Agenda 21. The people of Alabama, through their elected representatives, will govern Alabama, not the United Abominations. And by the way, that passed unanimously in Alabama. Every Democrat voted for that. And we can't do it in Florida, right? Now, Florida has done some really good stuff during the scandemic, whatever you call the thing that just happened. You guys remember Joe Biden and OSHA said, hey, you're all going to have to take a vaccine. Well, vaccine, I put it in air quotes. I think you guys remember that. We're supposed to forget now. None of that happened. Just forget all about it. But no, it happened. But our state got together, and on November 18th, 2021, our governor signed into law Florida Statute 381.00317, the private employer COVID-19 vaccination mandates prohibited. Okay? And according to this law, if an employer decided to fire somebody because they wouldn't take the shot, wouldn't give them a religious exemption or whatever, they would be fined $50,000, which was almost 10 times more than the fine that the federal government was going to impose. This is an excellent example of the state standing in the gap between us and the federal government. I really appreciated what Ron DeSantis said to Joe Biden. Joe Biden said, get out of the way if you don't want to help. He said, I'm not getting out of the way. I'm going to stand in between you and the people of my state. And that is the job of every government official. When the higher magistrate is behaving like a tyrant, when he's behaving lawlessly, when he is perpetrating evil, your governor and your sheriff and your mayor and your county commission and your city commission all have an obligation to interpose and say, no, you're not doing that to my constituents. I took an oath to uphold the Constitution. Not only are we not helping, we're going to stand in your way. So thank you, Governor DeSantis, for that. Now, more and more states are passing laws to promote constitutional money. They're taking taxes off of gold and silver. Texas is way ahead of everybody. They've got a gold bullion depository owned and operated by the state. Working on a big article about this now. There are bills now all over the country to get gold and silver back into circulation in commerce. In Texas, they want to have their gold bullion depository issue debit cards to anybody who has gold deposited there, so that you could go to a merchant, you could buy whatever you wanted. If the merchant wants gold, they'll just transfer the gold to his account. If the merchant wants Federal Reserve notes for whatever reason, they'll sell the gold and give them Federal Reserve notes. We need stuff like that all over the country. The federal government is out of control. The Federal Reserve is out of control. And we need to do it. Now, Democrats have started understanding this stuff. You notice that there are more than 30 states that are flagrantly defying federal law when it comes to smoking marijuana. Our state is one of them, by the way. If you go to a doctor and get a note, you can go smoke marijuana. That's totally in violation of federal statute. It's also in total violation of UN drug conventions going back decades. And yet Florida did it. Did the UN send their armies? Did Joe Biden? No, right? So how come Democrats can do that? We ought to be able to do it too when the federal government's out of control. Now, some Republican states did this. Starting in 2005, the federal government started trying to impose the Real ID Act. They wanted us all to have a federally certified ID with federal standards connected to federal databases. And Montana took the lead on that. They passed a law saying, we're not going to comply. And you notice they still have not been able to get the states to do this. Every year you go to the TSA and the TSA says, next year we're going to start enforcing this, right? Next year we're going to do it. And then next year comes and they move it back again. You can go to TSA right now and say, next year we're going to start enforcing this Real ID. You better get one. Tell your state to give you a Real ID. So we've now got 28 states that have refused to comply with Real ID. Little by, our state is not one of them, by the way, but little by little they are falling, unfortunately. And a lot of states have passed laws nullifying federal attacks on our gun rights, federal usurpations of power that have no place in our laws. Now, the fake news, the federal supremacists, even the Democrats who want to smoke marijuana, they want you to think that this all goes back to those evil, racist slaveholders from the South. That's where nullification came from. It was those racist Southerners who didn't want to give up their slaves. In fact, nothing could be further from the truth. It's literally the opposite. Right? One of the reasons that South Carolina gave for seceding from the Union was that the northern states were nullifying unconstitutional federal laws purporting to require that northern states return runaway slaves to their owners. Okay. I can read it to you. Here's the Declaration of Immediate Causes from South Carolina. This is why they decided to secede from the Union. They said that there's been an increasing hostility on the part of the non-slaveholding states to the institution of slavery, and it has led to a disregard of their obligations, and the laws of the general government have ceased to affect the objects of the Constitution. In other words, the northern states aren't enforcing unconstitutional federal laws, and we're mad. We want our slaves back. How can the fake media lie so much? I mean, we all know they lie, but this is like a whole nother level. They're literally flipping history upside down. The Southerners blasted Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New York, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Iowa. All of those states were refusing to enforce federal laws requiring slaves to be returned. Here's what they said, South Carolina, in their declaration. In many of these states, the fugitive is discharged from service or labor claimed. Thus, the constituted compact has been deliberately broken and disregarded. So don't let anybody tell you that nullification comes from slavery. In fact, it's exactly the opposite. The slavery holders wanted the federal government to force the states to return their slaves to them. Now, the Supreme Court actually agreed that the northern states had absolutely no obligation to comply with these laws. They ruled in 1842 in Prigg versus Pennsylvania that the federal government had no power to force the states to help catch runaway slaves and send them back to their owners. The same is true today, by the way, right? The states have no obligation to help the federal government enforce an unconstitutional abomination, fake law. We've got recent decisions. You're going to hear from Sheriff Mack. He's going to talk about Prince versus the United States in 1997. They re-articulated. And it's not just states. Sheriffs also cannot be commandeered by the federal government to do what the federal government wants. It's the anti-commandeering doctrine. And praise the Lord. And so where do these ideas come from? Right? They're not new. They weren't developed during the Civil War. They weren't specifically to deal with slavery. It actually goes back even long before the founding of our republic. But let's look at what the founder said. James Madison, widely regarded as the father of our Constitution. He wrote in Federalist number 46 that state governments possess a means of opposition to federal overreach. And that means, he said in Federalist number 46, was refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. Hey, we passed a gun control law. You need to help us confiscate guns or kill babies or what? No, we don't. Read Federalist 46. A decade later, Madison went even further, along with his buddy Thomas Jefferson, who's often known as the father of our Declaration of Independence. The Alien and Sedition Act. See, early on in our history, the Congress was already getting out of control. They passed the Alien and Sedition Act. They didn't want people saying things that they didn't want said. And so they passed this Alien and Sedition Act. And Thomas Jefferson and James Madison wrote the Virginia and the Kentucky resolutions. And here's what they said. In case of a deliberate, palpable, and dangerous exercise of other powers not granted by the said compact, the states who are parties thereto have the right and are in duty bound to interpose for arresting the progress of evil and for maintaining within their respective limits the authorities, rights, and liberties appertaining to them. In modern language, not only do the states have a right to refuse this absurdity, they have a duty. They are duty-bound to interpose on behalf of their people. Now, this wasn't just certain founding fathers. Even the most radical of the federal supremacists among them. You guys remember Alexander Hamilton, right? Lots of differences of opinion with Alexander Hamilton. But he wrote in Federalist 78, there is no position which depends on clearer principles than that every act of a delegated authority, contrary to the tenor of the commission under which it is exercised, is void. He said, no legislative act, therefore, contrary to the Constitution, can be valid. Again, putting that in modern language, if the Congress passes a statute that is not in accordance with the Constitution, it is not valid. It is no law at all. Hamilton made a similar argument in Federalist Paper number 33. He said, if a number of political societies enter into a larger political society, that's the states coming together to create the Union, the laws which the latter may enact, pursuant to the powers entrusted to it by its Constitution, must necessarily be supreme over those societies and the individuals of whom they are composed. We're all agreed on that. Any laws passed in pursuance thereof are constitutional. But he goes on to say, but it will not follow from this doctrine that acts of the large society which are not pursuant to its constitutional powers, but which are invasions of the residuary authorities of the smaller societies, will become the supreme law of the land. Get this. These will be merely acts of usurpation and will deserve to be treated as such. This was the most radical federal supremacist. This is a guy who wanted the most powerful federal government possible. And even he is saying, anytime Congress acts outside of the authorities that we have delegated to it, that's not a law. It's a usurpation. It's a pretend law. And we have no duty to obey it. Whether you're a policeman or a citizen or a mayor or a county commissioner, we have no duty to obey these things. In fact, we should treat them as the usurpations that they are. In fact, our whole revolution, the reason we became an independent country, came because people refused to follow unlawful orders. You probably remember, if you got an education prior to like 20 or 30 years ago, the British came and they said, hey, hand over your guns. And we said no, and we shot them, right? We're not handing over our guns. Sorry, not going to happen. And that, of course, was the shot heard around the world. Reverend Jonas Clark, one of the pastors who helped lead the men, said, from this day will be dated the liberty of the world. But guess what? It wasn't our founding fathers who came up with these ideas. They were standing on the shoulders of other giants. So let's talk about some of those other giants. Sir William Blackstone, he wrote Commentaries on the Laws of England. He was actually the most cited legal scholar by our founding fathers. And his book, Commentaries on the Laws of England, is called The Bedrock of American Jurisprudence. And he said, all laws are based upon a higher law, and all laws must be in conformity with that higher law. He said, God's law, as revealed in the Bible, represents those superior laws. And he said that upon these two foundations, the law of nature and the law of revelation, that's God's written law, depend all human laws. That is to say, no human laws should be suffered to contradict these. So obviously Congress has all legislative powers, not the Supreme Court. But let's just say 9 guys wearing robes decide that they're going to make a new law that they found in the penumbras of the Constitution that you can murder babies. Is that a law that should be suffered? No, of course not. Every one of the governors of the union should have said, that's ridiculous. I mean, you guys have no right to make law, but even if you did, that would be a totally unconstitutional law, and so we're going to continue enforcing our murder laws. You're not going to be able to kill babies in our state. Pretty simple, right? Now, he went on to say, Sir William Blackstone, he said, God's laws are binding over all the globe, in all countries and at all times. No human laws are of any validity if contrary to this, and such of them as are valid derive all their force and all their authority, immediately or immediately from this original. The doctrines thus delivered we call the revealed or divine law, and they are found only in the Holy Scriptures. This was the worldview of the people who wrote our founding documents. We are never going to restore our country unless we understand what produced it. So we do have some really encouraging things happening at the county level. I want to talk a little bit about those, but before we get there, I want to go to the Bible, because a lot of these ideas came directly from the Bible and from Christian history. And of course, before William Blackstone did those things, how many are familiar with the English Civil War? A handful, okay. So you had King Charles I behaving like a tyrant, and he actually dissolved Parliament. I don't need you guys. I'm in charge here. And Christians fought back. They pointed to the Magna Carta, which we'll talk about in a moment, that had been signed about 400 years earlier. And under the leadership of Oliver Cromwell, a Puritan, a member of Parliament, they raised up an army. They charged King Charles with treason. They put him on trial, and they beheaded him. True story. Okay. This was still fresh in the minds of our founding fathers and the American people and, of course, the British people. And this actually established, at least in the Anglo-Saxon world, very firmly a principle that had already been articulated a long time before that. And that principle is lex rex. The law is king. And so there had been this debate going on. A lot of the kings said, no. Rex lex. The king is the law. Whatever I say is the law, and you all must obey. And in Britain, where the Reformation took root, they said, no, king, you have this backwards, right? You are also subject to God's laws. You don't get to murder people just because you got a fancy crown on your head. You don't get to steal from people. And of course, even in the 1600s, they weren't inventing these principles out of thin air. You got to go back to the Magna Carta. You had King John behaving like a tyrant. And the lesser magistrates, the aristocrats, the barons, the nobles, said, hey, you can't do that. You have to obey God's law too. So they went to the Archbishop of Canterbury, Stephen Langton, and they asked him for help, and they ended up writing a document that limited the king's powers. So on June 15th, 1215, they held him at sword point, and they said, look, you're going to sign this. They called themselves the Army of God. You're going to sign this, or you're going to die, and you're going to lose your throne. So you can either obey God's law and respect our rights, or you're going to not be king anymore. And if King John refused to obey in the future, they said, we're going to wage war on you and we're going to remove you. Here's some of the things that the Magna Carta protected. Rights and liberties for the church, right to petition for redress of grievances, no excessive fines and punishment, no taxation without common counsel. Some of these should be sounding familiar, I hope. You need credible witnesses to be able to bring legal charges against somebody. You need to have due process of law, speedy trial. And by the way, the Magna Carta ends with, for the salvation of our souls and the souls of all our heirs and unto the honor of God. True story. Read it. And this isn't just some arcane, ancient document that, maybe a PhD in history might be interested in. The U.S. Supreme Court has cited it more than 100 times in its own rulings. It's the foundation, the common law, which of course comes from the Bible and made its way up through the centuries to what we have today, or at least what we're supposed to have today. And actually, in response to the Stamp Act that the British passed, the Massachusetts Assembly said this was against the Magna Carta. It's against the natural rights of Englishmen. You cannot do this. So again, you have an example of the lesser magistrate resisting unlawful, illegitimate authority from the higher magistrate. And where did all these people get these ideas from? They read their Bibles. Okay. Very early on in the scriptures, you have lots of examples of this. You go to Exodus chapter 1. The king ordered the Hebrew midwives to kill all the baby boys. And they read Romans 13, and they said, yes, sir, we're killing right away. Some of you read your Bibles. That's not what they did, right? So the king said, if it be a son, ye shall kill him, but if it be a daughter, then she shall live. But the midwives feared God and did not as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the boys alive. And therefore God was really mad at them because they must not have followed Romans 13. No, Romans 13 came much later. Just kidding. It said, therefore God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and waxed very mighty. God dealt well with the midwives because they defied the king and refused to kill baby boys in response to his unlawful order. That's Exodus 1, chapter 1, verses 15 through 20. In Exodus 5, you see Moses demanding that Pharaoh release God's people from slavery. And when he refuses to comply, God breaks his back, destroys his army, and sets his people free. I think that's one reason people hate Jews so much, right? It's like the greatest slave revolt in all of human history. 1 Kings chapter 18, Elijah rebukes the king Ahab. Why? For his evil policies, for his idolatry. He says, I have not troubled Israel, but thou and thy father's house, and that ye have forsaken the commandments of the Lord and hast followed Baalim. And guess what? God stood with Elijah and absolutely humiliated the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. You probably remember the story. They did all their dancing, and then they all died. Okay. Daniel chapter 3. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These were lesser magistrates. Right? They had a high position of authority within the realm. And King Nebuchadnezzar one day decided, I need everybody to worship this big golden statue that I made. So when you hear the music, everybody bow down, worship my statue. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said, no. In fact, I'll quote to you what they said. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we are not careful to answer thee in this matter. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace. And he will deliver us out of thine hand, O king. But if not, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. Amazing. And you guys hopefully know the rest of that story, right? Nebuchadnezzar got really mad. How dare they defy my authority? He threw him into the burning fiery furnace, made it extra hot. Right? And God protected them, right? And then something incredible happened. God used the righteous defiance of these Hebrew boys to glorify his own name and bring King Nebuchadnezzar to his senses. Nebuchadnezzar spake and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants that trusted in him, and have changed the king's word and yielded their bodies that they might not serve nor worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree that every people, nation, and language which speak anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut in pieces, and their houses shall be made a dunghill, because there is no other God that can deliver after this sort. Now, we today don't have any guarantee that God will protect us from the fiery furnace. We may go to jail, we may get in trouble, but that's okay. We still have an obligation to refuse to submit to ungodly, wicked decrees, no matter who they're coming from, whether it's a president or a governor or a Congress. And there are many, many more examples of this. I want to talk about counties just for a moment before we wrap up here, because there's a lot happening at the county level. I've written a few articles for the Epic Times over the last few years on this very issue. And it started in Nevada. Summer of 2021, the elected commissioners of 2 Nevada counties decided that they were going to become constitutional counties. And they passed an incredible resolution. Elko County on June 2nd, 2021, said that unconstitutional acts committed by anyone will be treated as criminal activity. They said they were going to be a constitutional county. They also joined the Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association as a county. And they said this: the people of the United States are and have a right to be free and independent. And these rights are derived from the law of nature and nature's God. As such, they must be free from infringements on the right to keep and bear arms, unreasonable searches and seizures, capricious detainments, and every other natural right, whether enumerated or not, pursuant to the 9th Amendment. By the way, that was approved unanimously by their county commissioners. It reaffirms the 10th Amendment and does much more. It says abuses of these kinds will not be tolerated in Elko County. And they list a whole bunch of different things that will not be tolerated: violations of the First Amendment, efforts to register firearms, efforts to confiscate firearms, violations of privacy, infringements on property rights, detaining and arresting without following constitutional procedures, and so much more. I talked to the chair of the county commission there. He had some really great stuff to say. You can go read those articles. Lander County in Nevada also approved something similar. Later in 2021, counties in New York hopped on the bandwagon. Truly incredible. It started in Cattaraugus County. They said, we're a constitutional county, and they said this was a response to the COVID madness. We are not going to let you destroy our businesses, shut down our churches. Absolutely not. And you know what? So far, there's only been a handful of counties across the country. Excuse me? Oh, thank you. Very good. So we got 2 minutes left. So there's only been a handful of counties so far. But what would happen if 50 counties in Florida and 50 counties in Oklahoma and 30 counties in Montana and 20 counties in South Carolina all said, look, we're not going to put up with this stuff anymore. We're not going to let you abuse our citizens. We're not going to let you force people to take injections they don't want. We're not going to let you confiscate guns from people. We're not going to let you build firearm registries. We're not going to let you shut down churches in response to some public health scare. We're just not going to tolerate it. We could stop this tyranny in its tracks. And thankfully, we've got shoulders of giants to stand on. We're not standing on our own. We're not charting new territory here. We're just doing what our forefathers did. The reason we enjoy the blessings of liberty, or what's left of them today, is because they were willing to put their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor on the line so that we could be free. And so my question for you today is, are we willing to do the same? Thank you guys, and God bless you.